In this video, I'm going to walk you through 10 tips to improve your astrophotography. Now, astrophotography is a notoriously complicated genre of photography, so I'm going to run you through 10 tips that should cover most astrophotography situations. So let's jump in with tip number 1, and that is to first research the Milky Way positioning in the sky. And there's a couple ways you could do this. My most preferred way to do this is within Google Earth. So if you watch the Google Earth video that I walked you through earlier, if you go into Google Earth and you simply look into the sky when you change the time of the day to night, you can see exactly where the Milky Way is going to be positioned in certain compositions. So you could literally put yourself on the ground in a certain area and see where the composition of the Milky Way is going to line up. So this is perfect if you're trying to get it over a certain mountain, or you want a certain tree in the corner of it, or you want a certain waterfall behind it, or in front of it for that matter. And there's also a ton of other apps out there like photo pills that you can use to align the Milky Way as well. A lot of them have augmented reality capabilities, so you could simply put your phone into the mode and put it up into the sky and see where certain stars, constellations, the moon, and the Milky Way is going to be at certain times. So those are enormously helpful. And then one final tip is to keep in mind that there is a particular season for the Milky Way, and that is from February to October for the Northern Hemisphere, and from late January to November for the Southern Hemisphere. So depending on where you are, that's where you'll be able to see the galactic center of the Milky Way and be able to get the most amount of detail in your Milky Way shot. So keep those times in mind. The second tip I have is to look into a star tracker if you are serious about Milky Way photography. And a star tracker is essentially a device that you put on top of your tripod and you connect it to your camera. And what this star tracker does is it will follow the stars as they are slowly moving throughout the sky. So as you're soon going to realize when I talk about the camera settings for the Milky Way, you're not really going to shoot longer than a 15 to 25 second exposure. But a star tracker will allow you to get much longer exposures and therefore capture much more detail in the Milky Way. So you'll be able to get much more color, see more stars, and more distant planets in your shot. So if you're serious about a detailed Milky Way shot, look into a star tracker. The third tip I have is to get your camera settings dialed in correctly. So astrophotography has a fairly specific parameter of settings that you want to get dialed in. And I'm just going to drop that knowledge on you right now so you don't have to try and figure out and guesstimate what's going to work out in the field. So let's start with ISO. And generally you want to be between 3200 ISO and 6400 ISO for the best results. So this will allow you to bring in enough light to actually be able to capture those stars in the night sky, but it's also not going to be overkill and create too much noise in the sky. So depending on what camera model you have, you might have to mess around with these settings a bit. Some cameras can actually go all the way up to 10 or 12K without a lot of noise, but that's only for very specific high-end models. So check your camera and see what it can get up to. For the focal length, I'd recommend somewhere between 14 to 28 millimeters, but generally you want to be on the low end because the Milky Way usually covers a pretty wide expanse in the sky, so having a wider angle lens is going to do you better in that situation. In terms of shutter speed, you generally want to be somewhere between the 15 to 25 second exposure range. Usually it's going to be somewhere in the middle, around 20, but if you get any higher than that, then you're going to start to get blurry stars. So they're going to start to have a little bit of trail because of the movement of the Earth, and it's just not going to look as professional. Generally, you want to aim for tack sharp stars that don't have any movement in it. That is the first way I can usually tell if someone's an amateur astrophotographer. And then finally, in terms of aperture, generally you want to be shooting somewhere in the f2.8 range or even lower if you have a lens that can get to 1.8 or 1.4 for example. But you know, f2.8 should work ideally in most situations. The fourth tip I have is to understand the 500 rule. So the 500 rule essentially allows you to use a formula to understand the exact amount of shutter time that you can get up to before you start getting blur in those stars. So as I mentioned before, most of the time you're going to be shooting 15 to 25 seconds, but if you want to know that exact number, this is the formula you use to do it. So this formula assumes that you're shooting at an aperture of 2.8 and that you have a ISO of either 3200 or 6400. And what you do is you divide 500 by the focal length of your lens that you're shooting at. So for example, if you're shooting with a 50mm lens, 500 divided by 50 is going to be 10, which means you can get up to a 10-second exposure with a 50mm lens before you start getting blur in those stars. So this allows you to make a very precise calculation. If you are shooting with an APS-C lens, you're going to want to multiply your focal length by 1.5 before you divide 500 by it. And if you're shooting with a Canon, you're going to multiply it by 1.6 because Canon is slightly different in their crop sensor lenses. If you're shooting with a micro four thirds lens, you're going to want to multiply the focal length times 2 before you do the division. So that is how you use this formula to calculate the exact amount of shutter speed you can use. And this formula is not always going to be precise. It's not always going to be correct, and you could make a math error. So always double check when you take your photo of the stars to make sure those stars are actually crispy clean and you're not getting that lens blur before you go home and find out all the way back in the lab. So the moral of the story, always double check after you take a shot just to make sure you aren't getting that blur. The fifth tip I have is to use a shutter delay of 2 seconds or more when you are taking your photo. So this means that when you hit the shutter button on your camera, it's going to wait 2 seconds before it starts taking the photo. And this is just to ensure you don't get any blur in your shot from pressing that button down on the camera and shaking it a little bit. So I generally do this with all long exposures, just a 2-second delay, but it's particularly important with Milky Way shots because it can get blurry really easily. The sixth tip I have is to achieve focus in your camera on a star. And the way to do this is a little bit complicated. You don't just put your autofocus on a star and hope it works. You usually want to switch into manual mode on your lens in order to get a precise focus. But before you do this, you're going to want to make sure that your brightness is all the way up on your display and exposure simulation is checked within your camera if it has it, just to make sure that your LCD screen is the brightest it can possibly be. Then you're going to switch it into manual mode, and on your lens, you're going to turn the knob till you see the infinity symbol. So this is going to allow you to focus on the furthest away possible thing in your lens. So for stars, this is a great starting point to be at. However, we want to get it even more precise than the infinity mode. So from here, we're going to go into our camera settings and zoom into the screen. And the way to do this is sometimes it's called live view mode. Depending on what camera you're in, it might be something different. But essentially, you're going to zoom in on your focus, pick the brightest star in the sky, and then turn your knob just ever so slightly until that star is in perfect focus. And then once you have it lined up, that's it. You're in focus for the night as long as you're not moving your camera around. The seventh tip I have is to look for dark sky areas and avoid light pollution in your shots. So this means you're going to want to be away from big cities that can cause a lot of light pollution in the sky, because this is going to hide the stars. So in the more remote region that you're in, the better luck you're going to have. And there's particular state parks and national parks, at least in the United States, that have dark sky regions. So they're officially known as areas that are great for astrophotography. So look into those dark sky areas. You can also pull up a dark sky map on the United States and find areas that are particularly dark compared to other areas. And it also goes without saying that you're going to want to plan these shoots around the weather. So obviously, if there's any clouds in the sky at all, you're not going to be able to get astrophotography. So plan your shoot around clear day skies. The eighth tip I have is to try out a twilight blend. So a twilight blend is where you set your camera in one shot during blue hour. So this is after golden hour, and you're going to put it in the composition that you want to get your Milky Way shot in. But since there is that blue light going, you're still gonna get a lot of detail in the landscape. So this is great for getting awesome foregrounds, like if you want a cactus in the foreground, or if you want a mountain, or if you want a waterfall, or really any landscape in particular that you want to have within your shot, but you want it to have detail and not just be a silhouette or shadow. So you essentially take that shot during blue hour, get all that detail, make sure there's no shadows that are clipped, and then you just leave your tripod in that spot for another hour or two, maybe 3, depending on how long it takes for the Milky Way to arrive in your area. And then you proceed to take a long exposure of the sky. And then you'll have a Milky Way shot, and you'll have that blue hour foreground shot. And then what you can do in Photoshop is use a mask to blend those two together. And if you watch my editing course, there is a video that teaches you how to do sky blends and also exposure blends that should show you how to do this sufficiently. So this is a great way to get awesome detailed astrophotography shots if you don't want just the bland silhouette of an arch or something. You want that actually detailed arch in a shot. So try it out. Even though it does take a while, it is worth the results. The 9th tip I have is to try out light painting. So if you didn't catch your blue hour shot, one thing you could do is bring an external light with you and use it to light up a scene. So I usually carry around a little RGB light that's pretty powerful, at least powerful enough for some basic light painting. And what you can do is set it in certain areas in order to illuminate certain objects. And this is usually great for smaller scenes. Obviously a mountain's not gonna be able to be illuminated by a little tiny light, but you know, if there's a cool rock formation or an arch or some trees or a cactus or something you want to illuminate, you can test out different ways to light that up by moving the light closer or further away, or get a ring light effect by putting the light behind the object you're trying to illuminate. And just really experiment with light painting and see how you could illuminate that scene and then blend it with a Milky Way shot. The 10th tip I have is for creating star trails. So how do you create those cool lines across the sky where you see the stars going all the way across if you don't want just single stars or a single Milky Way within your shot? So the way to do this is to put your camera in time-lapse mode. Then you take a 15-20 second exposure with everything lined up perfectly every 1 second for about an hour and a half to 2 to 3 hours. And this will allow you to get enough shots that you could blend all those together in Photoshop. And you could do this using either a light and blend mode in Photoshop, or you can use an external third-party program like StarStax in order to blend all these together. And essentially it'll mesh all those single shots of the stars together, so it just creates that giant line. And it's worth noting that the longer you do this, the longer your time lapse, the more you're going to have to mess around with and the longer those star trails will be. And the reason that this is a great way to capture star trails is because, for one, you get a singular photo of the sky with everything in focus, so you could use that. You also now have a time lapse. If you didn't want to get star trails, you can blend them all into a video and have a time lapse of the sky moving. And then finally, you could also create that scene with the star trails if you want to. And the cool thing is you can get very flexible with how you create these star trails. So if you want them to be shorter or longer, you can really just eliminate certain frames from the shot in order to make it as precise as you need. And the final great thing about this is if someone walks into your scene, say another photographer walks in with a headlamp and illuminates the ground in front of you, or some cars drive by with some headlights, or a plane flies across the sky, you can simply eliminate those singular shots from the image and not have them polluting your scene. So if you were to take one exposure that's, for example, a 3-hour long single exposure, if someone walks up with a headlamp on the ground, now your ground is just completely ruined because there's a headlamp there. So this allows you to have a lot of flexibility in how you create those star trails. So those are my 10 tips for astrophotography, one of the funnest genres of photography to do if you can stay out late. So let's jump into the next video.